Good day, everyone. Welcome to our A4E Air Cargo Policy Roundtable. It's hard to believe, actually, that just 1 year ago, A4E held its first air cargo policy event here in Brussels in a packed room, I might add. And I'm really pleased that several of our cargo CEOs are back this year, despite a very busy schedule. So thank you very much. And indeed, also a warm welcome to all of our speakers and those of you joining us today virtually. If we only had known in December 2019, when we asked for air cargo policies to be given a greater priority in Brussels, if only we had known that what the next months would bring, how critical a role European air cargo would indeed play in the course of 2020, not just in keeping the goods flowing freely, but really saving lives. In preparing for this event, we reached out to our air cargo members and asked them to look back at 2020 before looking forward. So here is what we've learned. Over 100,000 tons of personal protective equipment, the so-called PPE, was flown last year. To put this into perspective a little bit, that's the equivalent of about 1,000 fully loaded Boeing 777 freighters. Just think about it for a second. Also, more than 20 A4E airlines are currently engaged in COVID-19 vaccine transport, either transporting it by freighters, of course, in the bellies of passenger airplanes as well, or preparing to fly it on the main deck of converted passenger aircraft, which would otherwise be grounded. And it's these last ones we refer to these as freighter aircraft, by the way, and I think you will hear that term during the seminar as well. We also learned that A4E airline staff have volunteered with their local Red Cross agencies and some with medical training that are even assisting their local health authorities with COVID-19 vaccinations, which is a great thing indeed. In short, it's all hands on deck at the moment, and it appears it will continue to be this way for still some months to come, unfortunately. Nevertheless, there are a number of urgent policy issues that we really need to address. We need to see them addressed at EU level. Topping this list is, unsurprisingly, unharmonized national travel restrictions. You've heard this from us before. I really look forward to hearing more from our panelists just in a few seconds, specifically where policy action is needed the most and where the current outlook is for 21. So without further ado, I'd now like to turn things over to the moderator for today's first panel, Sam Morgan. Sam, it's actually good to see you again. Sam is, as you all know, an EU transport reporter who has been following these issues very closely on a daily basis. Sam, as I said, welcome again. It's good to see you, and the floor is yours. Go ahead. Thank you.
Many thanks, Thomas. Indeed, it's good to be seen in these troubling times. It's a new year. Welcome to this first panel, which is going to look at the outlook for COVID vaccine transport as part of this wider event we have for you today. It's a new year, but we are, of course, faced with the same problem that we had last year, the coronavirus pandemic. But as vaccines start to flow, there is light at the end of the tunnel. But how do we get the raw materials for those vaccines, the vaccine doses themselves, the syringes, the personal protection equipment that we all still need where it's needed? Well, air cargo is playing and is going to play an indispensable role in that regard. But how do we get there? As you've seen from Thomas's presentation already, 21 European airlines are already involved in this effort, and there will be more and more efforts to come in the coming months. Joining me today to discuss these issues and to give us some real key insights into what the rest of the year is going to look like, the obstacles, what needs to change for this to be a success. We have two panelists, and I'd like to introduce them to you now. First, we have Peter Gerber, who is CEO of Lufthansa Cargo, and is also the incoming Chief of Brussels Airlines. Welcome to you, Peter. And also we have Tim Scharwath, who is CEO of DHL Global Forward in Freight. Welcome to the both of you. We'll get into the Q&A shortly. Just a note to everyone tuning in at home. You can ask questions yourselves, which we'll get to at the end. Please use the Q&A function, which is down in the corner of your screen, not the chat, because we won't see them there. and try and address them to the panelists that you think would be best to answer your question. Before we get to that though, we have a short video that you'll have a look at now from Lufthansa, which will hopefully be a nice scene setter for the discussion we've got for you over the next hour or so. Enjoy.
We at Lufthansa Cargo are prepared for the transportation of the upcoming COVID-19 vaccines, and we have a task force in place which has 9 working fields defined, and we're specifically focusing, of course, on the temperature topic and capacity.
Lufthansa Cargo's Pharma Hub in Frankfurt is Europe's biggest temperature-controlled warehouse in an airport facility. We have 3 different temperature zones here in Frankfurt at 8.8 thousand square meters. We have 2 to 8 degrees in the back. We have 15 to 25 degrees we are here in at the moment. And we have a deep freezer up to minus 20 degrees.
And there we go. What a great, like I said, scene setter for the discussion we've got to come ahead. Tim and Peter, again, thank you for joining. I guess we could start, let's start at the beginning of the story in a way, shall we, with about this time last year. We were all very much in need of personal protection equipment, the masks, the smocks, all of these things for day-to-day people, frontline health workers. As Thomas's presentation at the beginning said, something like 107,000 tons of these things were flown into Europe all through last year. That's something like 5 billion masks, which I find a real hard number to actually comprehend. Peter, maybe you could sort of give us a taste of how challenging that was and how any sort of lessons you may have learned during that period are now feeding into the vaccine rollout. And is there anything that you think is a new obstacle that we need to really focus on? If you could mute yourself, yeah.
There we go.
We can hear
no,
you.
it works. Okay. Okay, thank you. So I believe before this crisis, we thought of ourselves as being a very flexible air cargo carrier. But I have to admit afterwards now, we really know what flexibility is, because maybe this was the biggest challenge we had. We had to literally every day, every hour last year, we had to look at our processes, at new processes, at government rules, at other government rules, at developments in the countries, breakouts of COVID and other things, find workarounds, reschedule the flight plans, reschedule the crews, all that. So I believe this was a big, big challenge, and we were able to perform this literally every day, and therefore this is the reason why I'm very proud of our team, but also of all other teams in the cargo aviation world, because air cargo has proven that they are really as flexible as they are reliable. And I think this was one of the key experiences that, of course, we knew nothing about flexibility before this crisis, but we proved successful being as flexible as the world needed it. So I think this was clearly one thing we experienced. The second thing is that it's really, really necessary to have a very close cooperation with all participants in the chain. This means between us and our customers, the big forwarders, the handling agents, but also especially the governments. I believe that's very, very important to be in constant talks with the governments, and of course try to set a scene. which is a little bit coordinated. I think this is also a big problem if there are rules in place which differ from each other. Of course, that's not easy for governments because they maybe are not always in close contact to any other government of the world we need when you see the whole value chain or the whole the whole transport chain. So therefore, it's paramount that they talk to each other, but also that we have the opportunity to tell government what our needs are, and they tend to react on that. And I have to say, big thanks up to now to the governments, because more or less they made everything possible. And maybe one of the general learnings we have of this pandemic is that this long lockdown for human beings was only possible up to now because two other things were possible and flew unhindered around the world. First, of course, is data, because what we are now doing, digitization, is the flow of data, and the second thing is the flow of goods. And I believe with these two things, we were able to manage the pandemic crisis up to now to a certain extent successfully. So maybe it's also one of the big learnings. Normally in our world, it needs three things to flow unhindered around the world. Now one is suspended. We all hope that it's getting better soon, but at least two of three have to work. Otherwise, I think our world, like we know it and want to have it, doesn't function any longer.
And Tim, I guess I would have a similar question to you about the initial stage of this pandemic, and how difficult was it for DHL to keep goods moving, basically? And do you think that, like Peter said about needing this flexibility, do you think that you have this built in now as we move into this, so we say, next phase of getting people what they need, the vaccine?
Well, I think forwarders will always argue that they have built-in flexibility anyway, because it's part of their job. We sell a network to our customers, and the network is all about competencies in every country of the world. So say if a customs export declaration system changes, we are the first ones who should know, who should advise our customers that something is changing. But I do believe, and I'm there 100% with Peter, what happened last year, maybe not a year ago exactly now, because things were still a bit quiet, but it happened then, and especially within the second quarter last year. This was a new dimension for us in the way that we handled things, because things changed very rapidly. And I really have to also agree with the statement that everyone within the chain at that time kept these supply chains going and running, which were of high importance for everyone involved, especially when you think about the PPE stuff. What was also very important for us in this time was that we made sure from day two, not actually day one, it took us a while to get behind it a bit, but to really make sure that our employees have a feeling that they're being taken care of in such a way that we try to keep them as safe as possible. Because if your employees can't do the handling or can't go to a warehouse, you're of course in a situation where goods cannot flow. And what we think the big thing for me was, if you would have asked me exactly a year ago, are we going to be able to manage our network our network from a home office environment, I would have probably laughed pretty loud and said, yeah, what's there to come? But that really worked. And I think that's not just because technically it worked very well, it's also the ability of the employees and the people in general, and we see that in all parts of the chain, all companies are partnered, that they were able just to do things in such a different way than they ever thought they could do it. And this resilience, so to say, or the flexibility of everyone in this in this part of the industry was really remarkable. And that's something which will always make me look back at this 2020 in a way where I think, wow, what we all did there is something which we can really learn of, to take all the things which are coming up now in front of us in 21 and 22, most likely, probably in a better way, because there was so much communication going on, because so many things changed. And we feel that we are the advisors of our customers, which are the end customers of the carriers, and that's important that we know and understand and can speak to them in such a way that they really know what they can do.
I mean, if we sort of look at the impact that the pandemic has had on the aviation industry in general, I mean, it's been quite devastating. Of course, not a lot of people realize how much freight is shipped in the belly of normal airliners, for example, and the effect that this has had on logistics supply chains. Peter, maybe you could sort of tell us a bit more of these freighters that Thomas mentioned, you know, these cargo planes that have been made out of a normal airliner. I mean, I know a few people have said to me, oh, why don't Lufthansa, Air France, or whoever just turn their A380s into big cargo planes. But of course, it's a more complex thing than that. How easy has it been to do this?
To be honest, it wasn't easy at all. And I believe we are one of the companies where this word freighters was coined. Of course, it's a mixture between a freighter and a passenger airplane, therefore freighter. And it's quite difficult because of the rules and regulations we have. I have to say rightful rules and regulations, because in a cargo airplane, there has to be fire protection. They have to follow strict rules. And passenger planes are simply not made for carrying cargo in the main deck. Of course, they are able to carry, as you mentioned, freight in their bellies. That's pretty fine. But on the main deck, it's very, very limited. So we had to make sure that all the rules and procedures applicable in all countries we were flying to worked well and in accordance with the authorities. And of course, we had to take care of the goods itself. So meaning we had to look for fire protection. So people flew within the plane in order to look for that. We had to look that the seats weren't damaged and all that, or we had to take out the seats. But then we had to look for the freight that's in accordance with all the rules there. So in one word, it wasn't easy. And the second thing is, from an economical point of view, it's more a joke than flying, because it's easy said that normally with a normal passenger plane you can transport some 30% of what you can transport with a freighter, but at the same costs. So this means you can do this also in exemption only occasionally if there's really urgent need, because our customers need the capacity so badly. But on the other hand, it's very expensive. So we do this as far as the market requires it, but not over this. So I think lastly, it's important what we did and all the other colleagues of the other carriers did. We tried to fly as much as possible with our main deck freighters. So increasing the density of the network to the utmost, bringing back freighters into service which had been parked, bringing into service new freighters, extending old freighters. So all this was done. And I believe we were able to reduce the lack of capacity to some 35 or 30%, depending on the lanes. So I think this is what we were able to manage. And of course, we are constantly pressing to even close this more, because what we really want to offer for our customers in the world is a dense and reliable network to the very important hotspots, to the very important airports of the world. And of course, occasionally, as we do now, we did it mainly in the second quarter of last year, but also in this first quarter of 2021, we also fly a lot of freighters, because there's such a big need and such an urgent need for this. So we do this as the market requires it. But again, it's only something which shows that in the crisis there are always ideas and always inventions, but to be honest, it's nothing we will see hopefully regularly after the crisis comes more or less to an end.
I mean, Tim, DHL, I'm sure, are not unaccustomed to shipping vaccines and other high-profile secure items in your airplane. But on the scale that is probably going to be needed over the next year, I guess this is uncharted territory to an extent. Have you already had to adapt your infrastructure, your planes, how your people work in order to prepare for this? Or is this something that you already have in place and can just ramp up? I mean, maybe you could tell us a bit more how you're going to do this.
Okay. Now, what we have since years is we have what we call it's a pharma customer network within our normal air freight network, which we operate anyway. So we have certified hubs and gateways around the world, which have been doing in the past normal pharmaceutical products, and of course also vaccines. We have been flying vaccines. There have been vaccines before these vaccines were there. And a lot of the big customers always differentiate between their normal goods, which they fly, so the normal goods, the temperature control goods, and the vaccines. Vaccines have always been special goods because of the need behind it, and also because of the tendency that they have normally lower volumes, but very specialized. If you think about the flu vaccine, for example, that changes every year, so those vaccines need to be there on time. And then also, of course, in the distribution to those places where you get your jab, your shot. So we are prepared for this. We have the setup for it. And we've been having discussions, of course, internally to make sure that we are more robust when we see now more volume coming up. And, there are a lot of ideas right now flying around how much extra volume that will be. And there are numbers between 60,000 to 80,000 tons of excess vaccine volume within the market this year. And this is something which we are clearly able to do. And we have a very close cooperation also to our colleagues, our sister division at DHL Express. They are the ones with an aviation fleet. So we have airplanes in-house, and we also work together with them to make sure that we are able to deliver and manage the situation as it develops, because the difficulty at the moment is to really foresee where these flows will go from where to where. And what's really important in this also in our thoughts is what Peter just passenger planes which were converted, normal passenger planes converted to freighters, they have one big advantage to any freighter. You can use them better on a point-to-point basis. So you can fly from smaller airports to very close, to airports very close to large distribution areas. So they're they will probably be seen more often second and third quarter this year as a good alternative in order to bring the vaccines exactly there where you need them. And then, of course, the more difficult part, in my view, is then the handling at the destination and the fine distribution into the warehouses or into the vaccine centers or cool destinations, whatever the setups are. They are unfortunately everywhere around the world totally different, and that makes it a bit more complex than, in my view, actually should be.
That brings me quite nicely to my next point, actually, about the people that will make this delivery happen, basically, the ground handling crew, the pilots, everyone. And the exemptions that could be needed for them from quarantining, from testing, that would obviously make this more achievable. Is this something that needs to be done with national governments? Is this something that the European Commission should be able to make easier? I mean, we've already seen them do things like green lanes and in the maritime sector for seafarers, for example. Is the situation as it is okay at the moment in terms of crew, or do there need to be changes made, basically? A question for both of you, I guess.
I believe, of course, there have to be some changes. The situation is so far okay to a certain extent, but I think what we have seen recently during the last weeks in Germany, but also in Europe and other parts of the world, is that the strength, the tightening of the quarantine regime and rules, which also sometimes apply or should apply to crews. This is a thing of constant headaches for us, because as Tim mentioned earlier, for our people, it's paramount that they know that they come back home when something happens. And I think otherwise we won't find people to work for us to distribute all the vaccines and other things. So this is something everybody in the world and all governments in the world should know, that this is shouldn't happen, that there should be rules which should to a certain extent be harmonized, and that there should be common rules, exemptions for quarantine, of course, for the crews and the transport workers making this happen. And in case something goes wrong, somebody gets infected or so, we should be able to take care of them, that we can bring them home. I think that's really paramount, that's essential, because otherwise all the things don't work. And so far, we were able to achieve this. Sometimes it was a little bit difficult, especially when it comes to China, but in the end we managed to do it. But I think this is something we should, in our national governments, but also within the EU, make sure that there are rules, common rules, which apply to everybody within the EU. And then, of course, the EU leaders should talk to all the other leaders in the world to make this happen and make sure that people can operate unhindered, can operate without this quarantine rules in order to get their job done, because this job at the moment is one of the most important jobs in the world. And I think this is something governments should think about. And luckily, so far, most of the time, when we apply to them, when we talk to them, then things change in the direction we needed. But what we observed during especially the last weeks, now with these mutancies and all the other things, that also governments grew more and more, a little bit more nervous than maybe they should be. And I believe panic is always a bad advisor. So I think we clearly have to make sure that this really works, and there is some kind of reliability for us and for all our employees doing this very important and great job.
Tim, would you agree with those points or add anything in terms of what governments need to do?
Yes, I would agree to these points. I think if there's uncertainty or information is in the press that no one really understands, and I'd like to take the example, I think it was this week or last week, when the quarantine regime in the Netherlands got changed and it wasn't clear if KLM would fly or wouldn't fly. The amount of questions we get from our customers to understand what that means for their supply chains is pretty high. And customers, I mean, for them, it's also very difficult at the moment. They're trying to keep companies afloat. They're trying to make sure their goods get to where they need to go. And any uncertainty in the supply chain at the moment from these kind of things is not helping us. And it also makes things more difficult again when they're trying to find the right way of working together, because people then tend to get nervous. And that's the end of the chain, so to say. So I think it needs to be clear that when there's policy changes, they need to be explained in such a way that everyone gets it, maybe 80%, doesn't have to be 100%, but is so far clear on what that means for his company, for his business, for him being part in the aviation chain.
In terms of, I mean, we've all seen at the moment the quite unpleasant spat between AstraZeneca, pharmaceutical company, and the European Commission about the doses and all of this kind of thing. We leave the political debate on that to the side for the moment. In terms of the logistical challenge of Lufthansa and DHL dealing with these pharmaceutical companies, what does that relationship look like? Is it these vaccines being given a priority service, for example, or are they just treated like any other customer, essentially shipping a product? I mean, maybe you could give us an idea of your sort of dealings with these big companies, because obviously I think that's of interest to people at the moment.
No, I fully understand that, and we have a lot of discussions on that. What does this mean? What does it mean if we have all these 60,000 tons at once to my supply chain, to my volumes? Is there enough capacity at the moment in a capacity-strained world where we don't have the capacity which we had in 2019? So the way we deal with it is that we try to have a clear understanding volumes flow. So forecasting is very important for us, and then we build it into our networks. So we're not going to let other customers down on this, but we will make sure, as we make sure with any kind of vaccine shipments in the past, that these vaccines are then treated and handled in the way they need to be handled, be it temperature-wise, be it also the handling requirements and so on, and be handed over to whoever then does the final distribution. Sometimes it's also us doing it. So we then work seamlessly to make this happen. But today, there is, in my view, there is enough capacity there. So if we look at the passenger flights, for example, which are grounded, that capacity, we can use that. Because if we look at it, the amount of volume which these doses, because we always speak in millions of doses, so the EU bought 100 million or 200 million. If you break that down, what that actually means into cargo units or what we actually fly, it's not so much, if you think about it. 60,000 tons extra in a market, or 80,000, whatever it is not going to break the market. And we have to also keep in mind that next to the 60,000, let's say that's the number, more or less the same amount of extra equipment is needed, be it gloves, be it masks, be it protective gear, which you also need to do to be able to manage the vaccine centers and so on. But that, in my view, is doable because we have capacity there, and it's something where we're not going to drop other customers, and we will make sure that the vaccines get the right that they deserve, and making sure that they are a high priority, as they've always been and always will be in the future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's absolutely right. What Tim states. We have since January also a special product for these vaccines to make sure that they have the utmost priority in our network. And of course, 65,000 tons sounds much, but alone Lufthansa Cargo handles more than 100,000 tons of temperature-controlled goods every year. So I agree to Tim, this doesn't break the market. At the moment, it's only a question of production, not a question of distribution. So we can clearly make sure that everything gets done. It needs to be produced, and there needs to be a regularity environment by the governments that we are able to transport it. And if those two things are given, we can transport them as quick as possible. So I believe at the moment this is clearly not the problem. And of course, as always, the close cooperation we have between us, for instance, Lufthansa and DHL, with the producers, this always helps because we are in constant talks since months for the processes, for the producer, for the procedures, for the legal framework, and the always changing legal framework. And I think this helps to a great deal that we at the end are prepared.
Just to maybe round off this point on capacity, which I think both of you have answered extremely well. I think maybe Tim, you already touched on this with you have the vaccines on the one hand, you also have the continuing need for the PPE, which will need to keep coming because the pandemic won't end tomorrow. Essentially, like you say, that the market can absorb both of those things. It's not an either-or situation where, well, we have to do the vaccines, so there will be a shortage of PPE, or vice versa.
No, absolutely, that's absolutely the way it is. To make sure that we get the capacity. I mean, there's lots of ways to get capacity. Peter described very nicely how that works. Also with the prick. I heard that for the first time today. That's why I still don't know exactly how to pronounce it. But the packed machines which you use as a freighter, the freighter. So that is something which you can really use there. And again, we have so many of these airplanes grounded at the moment, so we can use that to make it happen. And it's at the end of the day, I think it's a question of economics then to make it happen. But being in the situation that we're all in, I'm not worried about not being able to deliver these things.
Yeah, surely. I think there's nothing more. It's not nothing more to add. Maybe only one thing is this freighter, Prater, and we have this also in German, Tim. It's Frachter and Prachter for the Germans.
Oh, I like that. I like that. You are the masters of the elegant words in that regard, I would say. Just as a reminder to everyone watching out there, we have some time left, so if you do have any pressing questions for either of our knowledgeable experts, then please do get them into the Q&A function. We'll press on with my own queries for the moment, though. If we sort of consider the fact that these little doses of vaccine at the moment are arguably the most sought after items in the world, most valuable to people, you know, normally in the past we would say that's something like saffron or gold, right? But now it's these little bottles of clear liquid. Again, both of your companies have been dealing in very secure products for years now, so this is nothing new. But is there anything extra that you need to do in terms of security for these shipments, or is it just a case of using your existing framework?
For us, I can say that is something we are really used to, because we fly a lot of valuables also around the world, as you mentioned, gold and diamonds and all the other things. And of course, we are flying those vaccines and temperature-controlled goods for many, many years. So I think we know how to handle it, and we know that security is needed there. So I do not believe at the moment we really need special processes. Of course, if there are hints by the governments or by the police that we should do additional things, we will do that. But to be honest, we are used to that, and I think we can manage that.
I agree to Peter's sentiment. I think what I would like to add is that we have in our group within Deutsche Post DHL, of course, we have a global chief security officer who is responsible for security of everyone and everything within the group. What we did do differently this time, in a way, is that when we speak about where we have won an award or a contract, for example, we don't specify very more in detail what we do than how we do it, which we would probably do in a different environment. So that's maybe the only change. But the security aspects with security setups, the organization is there, and they handle this again like any other vaccine in the past or any valuables in the past or in the future.
And maybe if we just think about especially the situation in Europe with the respective frameworks that are needed, we've already mentioned the crew and ground handling staff, the quarantining and exemptions in that regard. Are both of you fairly confident that you've already said about how the governments have reacted quite well to this in the past over the last year? Are you confident that spirit will continue in a way that there won't be, the logistical side of things? You've already said very clearly you do have the capacity to deliver these 60,000 tons of extra cargo, but are you fearful that there isn't a political will in a way to get this done in time? Or is there anything you're concerned about, is essentially my question.
To be honest, I'm not really concerned, because for the moment the leaders have proven that they take their responsibility, and when the reasons for doing this or that are apparent, I think they will decide accordingly. So for the moment, I'm not worried. I think we have to be cautious, and we have to make very clear when things happen which do not fit into this vision or in this framework. But when we are able to stay in talks to make this clear in the appropriate moments, to be honest, in this case, I'm not worried.
I even think it's going to get better in future, because I think last year proved already, or made our industry, and let's not take only the aviation industry, but also the trucking industry, more prominent, that we kept supply chains moving and we brought PPE, for example, into Europe. And I think that politicians these days do see us in a different way than they probably did in 2019 in January. And I think going forward, when we do the vaccines in a good way, we make sure this works, then we will have a better stand, should have a better lobby in making sure that the difficulties and sometimes the uncertainties in these supply chains when it comes to local requirements, when it comes to customs clearance or other things, that they become a bit more harmonized and more simplified for all of us.
And if we just look to the future slightly, unfortunately, this may be basically a yearly thing, right? With the vaccines, that we may need to have these regimes in place on a semi-regular basis to prevent future pandemics. Is this already something that you as CEOs are thinking about in terms of planning for the next 5-10 years, about how you may need to basically change the way you do business, or keep aspects that you have changed over the last 10 months that were meant to be temporary but may need to be permanent? I mean, how does this whole thing change the way you approach your respective businesses?
I think our industry has recommended those things. And what's happening at the moment is, when we talk about such initiatives like Common Path or Travel Path, initiatives of IATA, the Airline Association, Worldwide Airline Association, or World Economic Forum, they try to get an electronic platform in order to make sure that people are able to travel freely, because the relevant information gets to the countries and to the state borders where they are needed. I think that's one example. We have to think all those personal health things globally. I think what we did during the last decades is we thought traveling, we thought transport, and we thought financials globally, but we didn't do this in respect of the health of human beings. And I think this is something we have to do now. We have to keep up with those other things we already mentioned internationally. And so therefore we have to undertake some steps together and coordinate it. And of course, these are also steps then we have to take into our recently companies in order to fulfill those needs we have. But in one word, I believe what we really have to do is to internationalize those healthcare issues. I think that's the most prominent thing we have to do during the next 1, 2, 3 years.
Yeah, and I think you need to start to invest more into your network to make sure that you are able to handle all the requirements which might come, because the -80 or -70 to -80 was something most companies did not foresee, that this would be a requirement for these kind of trucks. And I think that is something where we all, and we started investing into these things. And I think the one big change will also be the way that we work. I think the flexibility in working from home and having people work from home and then work in an office, these kind of things will stay with us. And technology-wise, we'll have to adapt also to more these kind of meetings as we have it now, than seeing each other in a more physical way like we did in the past. So I think that's going to be the big changes, the big drivers going forward also.
If I just turn to our Q&A section, we do have one for both of you actually. It's from Ralph Zeliger, and he basically asks both of you: have the cargo airlines been able to compensate for the higher operating costs with corresponding margins? I'm thinking in particular of additional positioning flights, stopover flights, and triangular flights. I guess that basically goes back to the economic argument of, can you do this without extra support, basically, or is it basically you're doing your existing businesses by transporting these vaccines so long as you have the right regulatory support? I mean,
yeah, I believe it depends on the markets and of the position of the airlines in the markets. What I can say of Lufthansa Cargo is that yes, we were able to compensate this because the prices rose accordingly with this tightening of capacity. So I believe we were able to compensate this because, of course, it depends on the different markets. In some markets, it was better. In others, it was not that good. But all in all, of course, we were able to compensate for these efforts. Yes.
No, I agree. From the forwarding side, I mean, we brought out our preliminary results 2 weeks ago, and they were also better than in 2019. And I think this is also one of the reasons is also based on the tighter capacity, which we saw on air freight, which also helped us then if you buy capacity very early in that stage, you're able to sell it to at a market price, which then happens due to the tighter capacity. Is also, of course, beneficial for your margins. But as Peter rightly said, this is totally different around the world, and markets developed totally different last year.
And we just turn to, I think, another question as well. There was a bit of news earlier. I guess a lot of people would have seen that the French pharma company Sanofi said that they would license the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, so they would help basically create extra doses. That's a bit of a quick development, should we call it? So, like you've already said about your inbuilt flexibilities, is this the kind of thing that you are ready to absorb as well? These quick kind of decisions by pharma companies to maybe free up capacity somewhere else, or is this something that you need notice about, basically, to put in the infrastructure or capacity you need?
Well, I think we are aware of where Sanofi has the production sites. They will not open up construct a new construction site, so they will do it in the well-known production sites that they have. And I think this is also a good example, depending on what exactly it is, because you have to see vaccine production also. It can be a very international way of doing it. You can do parts in one country, parts in the other country, and then bring it together in a third country. So that's the question, what exactly and how will they do it? But if they would produce the entire Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, say, somewhere in France, it's also going to be very easy for distribution, but Peter will not see much of it because it will be trucked then most of the time. As you see, for example, a lot of the pictures you see on the news nowadays are more and more trucks, smaller trucks also, but cool trucks who bring the product then from Antwerp somewhere into the Benelux, Germany, France or so. So I think, again, if you understand how the setup of these customers are, and we are in close contact with these customers, then we understand that they also talk to us, of course, then, not only to us, but to freight forwarders in trying to understand, if we do this, what does this mean for our supply chain? How can you support us there? So I feel very comfortable if these things happen. And I think it's also good because I think what we need now is more vaccines so we can start immunizing the population of any country within Europe.
Yeah, maybe I couldn't agree more. I think the thing I may add is that from the capacity side of airplanes, I do believe we really have enough capacity when this is urgently needed. So I'm pretty confident that we are able to manage this.
And just one question that Tim, you prompted me to think about this. How obviously the raw materials for these vaccines don't just come out of thin air. Have you already seen a lot of business already with from the pharma companies bringing in things from other parts of the world to develop these vaccines, for example? Has that been a big part of what you've had to deal with as well?
Well, we know of these flows, and we see these flows, and we sometimes fly these flows, but sometimes we also ocean freight these flows. and it's not as big as you think, and it's also not so special because the product, the raw materials, do not need special treatment like the end product needs at the end. So they're much more easier. And if you look at India, for example, a country where there's a lot of production when it comes to drugs anyway, but there's also production of vaccines. Here you see these flows going in and out, and things being developed there also for other parts of the world, which are not in Europe, for example.
Yeah, that's perfectly true. And again, you not always know what you are flying or for which purpose you are flying it. So sometimes we know, sometimes we don't.
I guess we start wrapping up at this point because we are on a tight schedule as always. I guess I would sort of ask the two of you to sort of round up with what your biggest, concern is about going forward. You've already said how the capacity isn't an issue, how governments have been quick to react and give you what you need. But what would be your wish list at the moment to make sure that we all get the jab in our arms by the end of the year? What would be your please give us this?
Yeah, I think my paramount wish is pretty clear. I think we really have to take care for a good quarantine regime, and we have to take care for a harmonized quarantine regime. So we have clearly to make sure that all our people working on this issue, distributing the vaccines and serving for the world here, can do this unhindered. I think that's paramount, and we have to look for good cooperation between us, the industry, and the governments, and of course a good cooperation within all the governments in the world. I think this is my biggest wish, and at the same time my biggest concern that it doesn't work as probably as we need it. So I think this is a point we have to continuously monitor, discuss, and talk about, and all the other things we get managed.
Same question.
Yeah, I would add to that I think we've come a long way since this 1 year now. We have vaccines, so I think this is something every society can be proud of. I would wish for a better alignment within governments and in other cases. And I think I would also wish for a bit more positive news on the entire development, because I sometimes sense that this brings people down and should actually motivate people that get to bring the best into them and making sure that we get through this quick. And I think last but foremost, we have to keep to the rules, keep distance. Don't forget the hygienic rules of washing your hands regularly and trying to stay safe from it ourselves. And if we continue that, then hopefully the entire issue doesn't become a stronger issue as it could be. And I think if we stick to that as a big wish, and then the vaccines come this year, we will be probably in a much better state. But by the end of the year, and then can look forward to any new mutations which come at us and new vaccines which have to be distributed then.
I think you make an excellent point, actually, Tim, is that the headlines and everything are filled with a lot of doom and gloom, unfortunately, at the moment. But this could possibly be a positive case for, there is a bit of hope, there is a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. I'd like to thank both of you for your time and wish you both every success over the course of this year. I, of course, we all have a vested interest in wishing you that. But yeah, and Peter, best of luck with the Brussels Airlines job as well. I look forward to finally getting back on one of your planes in the near future. To sum up, I guess, yes, the vaccine delivery challenge is a big one, but as you've heard from our two panelists today, there is a lot to be positive and optimistic about because of the built-in flexibility that airlines, logistics operators, and the entire value chain already has. But it does need support in terms of making sure that the people that keep that chain running has the support that they need. So hopefully, as we go through the next few months or so, we do get that. Please do stick around for the next hour or so, because we do have our second panel, a bumper panel that is going to look more into air cargo and its role in this whole issue. Please stick around, and Agnes Leroux will be moderating that panel. And to get you there, we have another video, a short one, that will set the scene nicely for everything that will be coming up in that time. Again, thank you to everyone for watching. Stick around, and I will see you when I see you. Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying with us for the second panel of our A4E cargo policy event. I'm Agnes Leroux, Policy Director at A4E, and I'm very happy to introduce our second panel. So we have with us Fredrik Wildtgrube, who is Vice President at Finnair Cargo. I'm also very happy to welcome Richard Forson, CEO at Cargolux, as well as Francesco Faiulo, who is a policy officer at DG Move, as well as Tânia Cardoso Simões, who is a board member at the Portuguese Civil Aviation Authority. And we're very happy to have her on board, as Portugal has taken the EU rotating presidency on the 1st of January. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Very welcome. Just maybe a quick reminder to our audience, if you wish to interact with our panelists, do not hesitate to do so via the Q&A button. Please do not use the chat, but the Q&A function, and I'll get back to that later in the discussion. So I think our first panel has really demonstrated how important air cargo has been in fighting COVID-19 in the last 10 months or 1 year or so. And we really had A4E carriers swiftly transporting protective gears.
It's on.
Please switch off your mics if you're not speaking. Thank you. And air cargo really more broadly is really at the backbone of the European economy. So I'd like to start the conversation this afternoon to really focus on quickly have your feeling and your perspective on what has marked 2020 in your perspective. So can I turn maybe first to Richard? How would you define 2020?
Thank you very much. Well, 2020 was a really challenging year for the cargo industry, not from respect in terms of demand for our product, but really from an operational perspective with the pandemic. If I talk in terms of financial performance, yes, it will be an excellent year for the airline, as one would expect when demand significantly exceeds the supply of capacity. But as I've said earlier, this did not come without significant operational issues to maintain the network that we did fly. The key advantage that we had was we've always been a very flexible organization, able to adapt at short notice to changing conditions. Although from a financial perspective, we will not be unique in achieving the results we did, but all the other dedicated freighter airlines globally would probably have done so as well. And added to this, we also have the combination carriers with both the PAX and the freighter fleets, and whose cargo divisions, I'm sure, will also deliver exceptional performance as well. And I think the measure of that performance is the extent to which they could adapt to the rapidly changing conditions. For a while, it was pretty chaotic in the market, especially in the months of April and May, when you had Western countries scrambling to procure PPE, personal protection equipment, from the Chinese market, as many countries at that stage were starting to prohibit the exports of PPE that were produced locally in those countries. So there, that triggered off panic buying in many countries, and as a result, there was a huge demand for capacity which could not be supplied. I can remember certain airports that we were flying out of, where the warehouse capacity was just not sufficient for everything that was being ordered and delivered. And we had trucks standing outside with millions of masks waiting to be shipped to Western countries. What really stood out in this whole pandemic is, from my perspective, an uncoordinated response on a global basis, not only from an EU basis, but on a global basis in dealing with this epidemic, which also to a large extent caused some of the operational issues especially the impact it had on being able to operate as a long-haul carrier and avoiding areas of hotspots where we would traditionally have laid crew over. The extent and duration of the remote working that was introduced, because what we did as a carrier was only keep essential personnel on site to ensure that operations could continue, albeit at a very much extended version compared to what was previously expected. The duration of the remote working of everybody at home. Yes, there are certain efficiencies that come to it, but continued remote working without social interaction with fellow colleagues also tends to result in a decline in efficiency over time, with many of our employees wanting to come back to the office, but for sanitary reasons and to curb the spread of the virus is to continue to maintain them at home. On the other hand, we also have employees that have now taken it for granted that they will always work from home at the end of the day, which is at times not in the interest of the organization. So it's going to be, I think, an issue that needs to be looked at from a company perspective when we start to bring people back into the office. At this stage, they are still working remotely. And Luxembourg being a small country, we also depend to a large extent on cross-border workers at the end of the day. So that's also an additional issue to be taken into account when people are working from home. Fortunately, to date, the surrounding governments have made certain exemptions in terms of taxation and social security coverage to enable this home working, but it will come to an end sooner or later.
Thank you, Richard, for this comprehensive first overview. If I turn to Fredrik, what would define 2020 for Finnair Cargo?
Thank you very much. And first of all, thanks for the opportunity. I hope everybody is feeling up to par, safe and healthy. 2020 was, I would completely echo with fellow colleague Richard on his statement, was a year of challenge. From a passenger-driven airline, one could say that it was a bittersweet situation because we also have a very strong cargo strategy, whom I'm particularly representing. We saw in the early part of the stages of year 2020, already moving into Q1, that there are concerns and challenges to the COVID-19 and the pandemic which started to rise. We also saw at this given time that we needed to take adjustments in our network and how we actually flew to meet with the travel restrictions that quickly started to become a global map issue. Simultaneously, as we were doing adjustments into our network, we started to ramp up the freighters, so the so-called cargo-only flights that was flying with passenger aircrafts. This was actually a very quick turnaround of performance where we adapted as a whole airline actually, a very cargo way of ramping up capacity and also adjusting to the demand. Finnair is also a very, very agile company, and we demonstrated this by moving very quickly into adapting and following actually our customers' signals and the customer needs. And we are continuing to do this actually to this day. We did see that there was a lot of concern and a lot of disruption in the market due to the PPE, the high request and demand of the PPE materials. This was definitely taking a lot of logistics enterprises by storm, even forwarders, shippers of the kind, which led to a lot of challenges, I would say, a lot of disruption also in the logistical path. Needless to say, the logical point to go to was the airlines, because the demand for the products was demanded with a high-speed fashion, and in this case, bridging the world that airlines have the ability to do was actually to sought after alternative. We had the ability through collaborative spirit together with our customers and stakeholders to build upon at very high, reliable ways of working so that we can actually satisfy the need of global national supply needs of the PPE material, so that we could assist the markets and also the people in need of this product. This could be the medical officers of the health organizations, etc. It was a privilege to have the ability to showcase also what our industry can do at its best, and to be part of the life quality improvement business, even if it was very short. But that being said, it was a privilege to do so. Moreover, the challenges as we continue to grow, I also this pandemic, we saw that the travel restriction also relating to crew was becoming a challenge, and how we needed to take this into consideration as we ramped up new stations, also with the cargo-only flights. This is actually a factor matter still to this day. Thank you.
Thank you, Fredrik. So we see that clearly from the air cargo sector, it's been a challenging year. There's no doubt about this. But there's also been a challenging year on the policy side. If I turn to the European Commission, I mean, Francesco, you're working from the security at the security unit in DG Move. So what was the most challenging in the last few months, and how did you tackle that?
First of all, Agnes, many thanks for inviting me to this interesting discussion. We surely take it as a sign of the excellent cooperation between the European aviation industry and us in this policy area, and specifically on security. I highly appreciate the excellent position paper on air cargo that A4E has circulated, and be assured that in many areas, I believe the association is spot on, and we share quite a lot of the messages, priority, and the auspices that you have formulated. So back to your question. We all, including the Commission as the principal regulator in aviation in Europe, we had to reshuffle our agenda and the priorities in 2020. We had brought forward as natural evolution that the aviation sector enjoyed throughout the years a number of interesting topics and policy areas that we wanted to develop further or even initiate. But we had to simply freeze them due to the more urgent and frenzy issues that the pandemic has posed. If I can put a gram of humor in that, we were debating at the end of 2019 how to tackle the capacity crunch in a decade or so, or even beyond. Of course, these are now considerations that are a little bit packed somewhere for the next future. But we are somehow trusting that the new normality will allow us also to have this kind of problems to face. A4E paper highlights the importance played by the air cargo sector in the current situation. All the initiatives that we have put in place during the pandemic to boost and facilitate the cargo sector have rendered more evident to the general public, because we all know as operator how important cargo is, but maybe it was a little bit obscure to the public opinion, the fundamental role that you are playing, we are also contributing to play. So from the aviation security standpoint, we have not operated in isolation. We are one of the factors contributing to the overall functioning of the aviation sector. We provided our contribution to the horizontal policy of the Commission, for instance, in the area of green lanes, connectivity, travel restrictions, and other fundamental issues, last but not least, ensuring priority in the transport of vaccines. So I'm not going to elaborate too much on that, because it was already covered extensively in the previous panel. So aviation security is highly regulated in Europe and also worldwide by Europe itself. This complicates quite a lot the equation, and it was quite clear from the beginning that the operators and also the member states would have difficulties in fulfill a number of obligations during the pandemic. Just to go back to operations at a lower level, you can imagine how problematic it is to ensure the renewal of training and certificates for aviation personnel, in our case, operating in security, the approval of the whole EU-bound supply chain from third countries, or even the renewal for airport identification cards in a moment where nobody's working, even the law enforcement agencies that have to ensure certain background activities are not capable to deliver. And this may have a dramatic impact or severely impair the capability of airlines and the industry to cope with the situation. So in our capacity as the guardian of the treaties, we were allowed to give member states the possibility to certain derogation or extensions or flexibility in the implementation of the requirements. This has been our main task during last year, just to make sure that security is still there, but also operations can continue their normal path. An important file we worked with member states, but also with industry, namely airports and security equipment manufacturers, was the redefinition of our technology roadmap in the specific case for airport equipment, because certain investments that had been foreseen in the past were basically not realistic anymore, and we had to ensure that this can be postponed or somehow reshuffle in the list of priorities we had. But in any case, any initiative we have taken during this period, our main goal has been to ensure that security and safety remain priorities. The last thing we want, and we will fight against, is to have a security or safety crisis on top of the current health and economic crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the good panorama there, Francesco. Tânia, turning now to you. I guess 2020 was equally challenging in Portugal and for the Portuguese CAA. What would you share with the audience? What was the most challenging, and how did you face it?
Well, first, I would just like to thank A4E for the possibility to share some of the views of the Portuguese presidency concerning aviation and air cargo. But as for what marked 2020, I mean, the grip of the current global pandemic that has, of course, tripled, as it was said, traveling and almost temporarily extinguished demand. Cargo had a different presence in the skies, and I think it's important to say that, mainly because of the transport of the health goods and currently of the vaccines. So there were some days in March and April where the biggest operators in the Eurocontrol network were really cargo companies. So this represented, of course, a challenge. And from a regulator's point of view, the main challenges were to ensure that, in spite of all the sanitary limitations, cargo could fly as efficiently as possible. Of course, safeguarding, as Francesco said, all relevant safety and security standards. That is, of course, a common rule for all regulators in Europe and throughout the world. We, as all operators in the sector and the economy in general, will have to adapt, of course, to a new working reality, as what said, reinforcing communications channels in order to, tele-answer swiftly to a reality in constant change. And in particular, our main challenge was to ensure that flight authorizations were emitted as quick as possible. That was our main concern during the first months of the crisis, especially for the transport of health and sanitary equipment. But of course, if I had to elect even the main challenge in 2020 from a regulator and even from a policymaker point of view, I would say that probably it was cooperation. cooperation within the sector and cooperation with outside the sector, namely with health authorities, which was not that common before, and we had to enhance cooperation and communication channels with authorities outside the aviation sector. That is sometimes not very easy to do. The enforcement of cooperation mechanisms in order to avoid a patchwork of interventions, as was required by some operators already, both at national and international level, was a clear priority. And of course, even though we would like even better results, I think some initiatives can be highlighted for their positive impact. Some of them already referred to, like the introduction, but I would like to refer also the introduction of green lanes, licenses and medical certificates extensions, like Francesco said, and the use of passenger aircraft for cargo operations, the often talked about prices today, were some of the examples. Exempting cargo pilots and crew from travel restrictions are also other examples that I think we should highlight, because the main concern, and I think the main focus in 2020 and probably still going on in 2021, was the necessity to cooperate. I think that was really the main challenge.
Yeah. Thank you for that, and that's definitely something we've seen not just for cargo, but as you pointed out, but throughout aviation, indeed, to collaborate beyond the transport sector. But then turning back to Francesco in terms of looking at 2021, what can we expect from the European Commission? You said there was some reshuffle of priorities, rightly so, to really tackle the pandemic and look at the emergency. But what is in the pipeline specifically for air cargo that at least the Commission would like to go through in 2021?
So I will start by reiterating the need to maintain facilitated channels for the transport and distribution of vaccines. From our point of view of security, we have established certain harmonized guidelines and instructions to member states and operators to provide common approach and especially legal and operational certainties to be implemented. This is very important. This is also just part of the solution, because the transport of vaccine in safe and secure condition involves many different aspects and not only security. While looking at the perspective of recovery from the pandemic, so the resume of operations back to normal, the Commission agenda on aviation security, I can say, is quite ambitious for this year. We have some important initiatives we want to bring forward and pursue, deliver, and I'm pleased to know that some of them are mentioned and shared in your position paper, the position paper of A4E. First of all, we want to resume our tables of discussions that are under the umbrella of what we call the EU Aviation Security Strategy Group. It is an important set of senior to high-level experts group where we have academic people, commission, member states, industry representatives, that we have given the task to discuss and elaborate on the possible future of aviation security, covering aspects, as you can imagine, on risk-based security, how to calculate commensurability between two different regimes that are capable to mitigate similar threats, a more holistic approach and looking at aviation security beyond the simple screening checkpoint if we use the passenger sector on that. So the meetings for these groups are being organized, so you will hear more from us on that matter, because we want to have some tangible results already by summer this year or right after. On technology, we are in phase 2 of the implementation of the EU harmonized regime of accrual of security equipment. We have deployed our database that hosts all the aviation security screening equipment, the different categories and models. It goes without saying, we have a database. It means that member states are obliged to mutually recognize and use that specific set of equipment throughout the union. We believe that this gives the necessary certainties to regulators and operators, and also gives visibility worldwide of what the standard, the global standard should be. And we do this, of course, in a certain dialogue and cooperation and like-minded approach with our main international partner, namely the United States. More specifically on cargo, your paper highlights the issue of the use of explosive detection dogs. This is something that we are working on that to ensure the full harmonization of certain practices throughout the supply chain, depending on the different jurisdictions. With regards to the EU-bound supply chain, in essence, the ACC3 regime, we have extended the facilitation granted last year in terms of extensions of approval of the actors in the supply chain due to the impossibility to perform certain on-site activities that are necessary to maintain the status. We keep also on working on the regime itself to improve it. For instance, in the area on harmonized implementation, resolution of non-compliances, but also identification in case there are some security concerns to tackle, to mitigate, and also clarification for member states and operators when it comes to the on-site validation, the designation process itself. On that, in that aspect, it's also important the fact that we are finalizing our new union database that will be activated rightly before or during the summer, which will function on a completely new platform and software with additional functionalities. What are these functionalities? It will be more intuitive, more comprehensive, so it will contain a lot of additional information that the current tool, which was designed many years ago, is not covering. You stress in your paper the need to enhance visibility of both EU-based and also third country operators. And this is the direction we have taken also in enhancing the capability of the IT tool. We will have more information on the operators operating in third countries, for instance, what kind of technology in terms of methodology of screening they are using. This of this will benefit largely the industry, the airlines that need to choose the right interlocutor to do business with. We are also completing the preparation of the first release of preloading advanced cargo information, the so-called PLACI. We have amended our legislation to include rules and provisions to be applied by third country operators, but also the protocols for the member states to react in case there are serious concerns. We see, and we will see even more in the future, that this new security layer is an integration to the existing ACC3 regime. They both render the supply chain more robust, but they work under two different concepts and philosophy. Both aviation security administrations and also customs administration in the member states are working hard to prepare the start in mid-March and doing some facilitation work, harmonizing the best practices and really initiating the ground for a harmonized implementation. PLACI is not an EU exclusive, as you know. Other international partners are already applying it, the US, and some other are considering future implementation. It is quite easy to imagine that there will be a number of similar regimes that are working on top of each other, interconnecting with each other. From the pure aviation security point of view, I'm not talking about customs, but the pure aviation security point of view, which is a consequence of the implementation of this regime. So what happens at ground levels, in the ground everyday operations. We've been working with the US authorities, so the Transportation Security Administration, to make sure that the respective programs are consistent and integrate each other when it comes, as I said, to the practical implementation of certain aviation security mitigating actions. So we both have recognized that the supply chain is global and we need to strengthen it with the global approach. We are also launching a legislative revision exercise in order to maintain the implementing provision in all aviation security areas up to date, realistic, in line with the evolving scenario. As you know, this is a quite demanding process that will keep us busy throughout the whole year, so until beginning of next year. Last but not least, our priority for this year is to adequately prepare for the implementation of the new EU regime on background checks and on cybersecurity, which both affect also the air cargo sector, as you well know. So digitalization is one of the priority of the current EU agenda. The more we go digital, the more we need to render our systems and data secure. On background check, we are aware of the auspice that you have formulated to achieve a level of mutual recognition of checks throughout the Union. This request is being considered within the horizontal table of discussions for the recovery plan from COVID-19. But what I can already, and I don't know what at the end the result will be, but I can already tell you that the new background check regime that we have introduced is expected to function at such high level of robustness and thoroughness that member states could feel confident in what the fellow member state has done. So there should be some kind of reassurances that they can all mutually recognize. So what I can conclude with is that we acknowledge the support that Portugal, for instance, has always given to the EU initiatives on aviation security. That's a clear sign on the commitment they have on security. And now, as a rotating presidency, I'm sure they take the right focus on the security horizontally.
Well, thank you, Francesco. There's clearly a lot for us to do, a very busy agenda. Just a clarification maybe for our participants. A4E has indeed published a position paper that you can find online on our website, focusing on policy challenges that we've identified for 2021. And maybe using the conclusion of Francesco and giving turning back to Tânia, how would you, out of this long list of priorities, what are those that have been identified and will be picked up by the Portuguese presidency on which you will be working in the next 6 months?
Well, the Portuguese presidency motto is time to deliver. So we do have to deliver concrete measures and for a fair, green and digital recovery. And this also, of course, has an impact on air cargo. This implies that the recovery must be sustainable and innovative. And we believe, as Francesco said, that digitalization will play a very important role. As for the Portuguese presidency work towards modernizing European infrastructures and connectivity policies, of course, the motto is to diversify European production and allow for its external suppliers and the EU's global supply chains. But there are no real competencies within the presidency. As referred to, many relevant measures or almost all relevant measures in this field are developed at the European level by the European Commission. And therefore, our role is to support and coordinate and connect countries so that we agree as fast as possible in the better and more efficient solutions for aviation. Of course, this implicates, as I said before, in the short run, cooperation and the necessary coordination, namely on travel-related measures, such as the electronic bulletin that is now being discussed at the European level and ECAC level, and it's expected to be released some kind of documents in a short time frame. I think it's important to say that cooperation is already being developed in order to allow for crew members, which is also an aspect that A4E ACE paper also refers. It is being developed in order to allow for crew members to be considered essential staff, exempted from lockdowns and quarantine measures throughout the union, and ensuring, of course, at the same time, ensuring that the necessary health-related measures are implemented. I think cooperation will lead, hopefully, as quick as possible to an efficient result in this matter, which is quite urgent. The presidency will follow also the Customs Union Action Plan. This does not directly concern aviation, but indirectly, of course, it has its impact in order to provide it with a stronger framework for the protection of the single market and the citizens. I think it should be highlighted again, the importance of the EU single window environment for customs, which will make it more easy for legitimate business to complete the border formalities, and in one single border. It will allow for collaborative processing, sharing and exchange of information, and a better risk assessment for the customs authorities. This should also have an impact in a more swift processing of all the cargo diligences. I think in the next six months, even if the Portuguese presidency will undoubtedly be marked by, of course, a limited number of passenger flights and cargo flights dedicated mainly to the distribution of the vaccines, I think we should also highlight that some long-term tendencies can be identified and should be strengthened and grabbed. And I'm talking about, for instance, the necessity to reinforce the cooperation and establish common rules, as was also referred to in the first panel, and the tendency to digitalization. I think it's a path that we will follow on. But mainly in the next 6 months, there will be no long-term implementation strategy, as for we will be dealing, unfortunately, with the strong effects and negative effects of the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you, Tânia. I mean, it's been clear from your two interventions that the policy agenda will certainly be very packed in the coming months. So turning back to our CEO representatives, from the airline side, what is, in your view, the urgent measures that need to be taken at EU level, really to both fight the pandemic and support the recovery of air cargo? Can I start with you, Richard?
Yeah, I think what the pandemic has really done is highlighted the critical role that air cargo does play in the economy. For many airports, air cargo to date has really been seen as a second-class citizen, where most of the facilities are developed for passengers only. But with this pandemic, you then see the complete opposite having occurred, where the passenger services facilities were useless, and what was required was the ability to handle the amount of goods that came in by air and to be distributed. And more importantly, I think there has to be a fully coordinated approach at the EU level. If we just talk about transport workers at the end of the day, I think it's still relatively uncertain where in line they actually stand in terms of being vaccinated. The information that's been given out by various governments, etc., has been relatively opaque regarding amount of vaccinations that are available, who will be vaccinated, what is the timetable, etc. So there is still a lot of uncertainty within the EU as to when people will be vaccinated. And we have many other countries which are smaller than the EU, but which have achieved tremendous success in vaccinating their populations. So there has to be coordination. And for me, unfortunately, I don't believe that coordination took place at the beginning of the pandemic. And what this results in at the end of the day is each country really following its own set of rules within the EU. for an industry, and one understands that Cargolux is a dedicated freighter airline operating a fleet of 37 47 aircraft out of a small country. A lot of our personnel are cross-border workers. They come from France, they come from Germany, they come from Belgium, they come from the Netherlands, etc., commuting or driving by car. And this does create operational issues with the restrictions that are introduced. It must be said, though, that the movement of personnel in respect of essential services, which included the cargo industry, the air cargo industry, has been recognized and exemptions have been granted. But what we see lately is more restrictions coming into play, which will make it more restrictive for pilots to get to work or for mechanics to get to work, etc., depending on various criteria that are established by country. And there is no uniformity amongst them at the end of the day. Each country is deciding what's best in its own national interest rather than looking at it from an EU perspective. Also, statements are regularly made regarding upcoming restrictions, but what is important for the industry is the actual text of the supporting regulation, so it enables us to analyze it and see exactly what impact it's going to have on our operations, and more importantly for the employees to particularly understand what they need to do in order to be able to move freely to and from work at the end of the day. We have gone to an extent as an airline in implementing our own testing facilities in-house. So we offer all of our employees that are on site the ability to take tests on a regular basis. It's paid for by the company, but it's signed off by a certified laboratory, and any employee on site is free to test himself as often as he wants. In respect of those at home, there's also an invitation that if you're home working, you can come in on a specific occasion. We're making an appointment to get tested. And so this has served to provide a great degree of comfort to our employees at the end of the day, because they have access to this facility. I think we've also spoken about the fact that the EU is now moving to a basis whereby background checks are harmonized between the different countries, because in Luxembourg we needed staff to work at the cargo center at one stage, whereas in other countries you had people without jobs but who had access to EU airports, but we could not automatically bring them across to work in Luxembourg, because they would have to go through background checks again, and so they had to be escorted wherever they went through. So those are the kinds of operational issues that we had to cater for as the demand exploded on the air freight side in terms of
that's where better coordination is needed at EU level. I think that's a common theme that back.
And I would assume, Okay. And also Brexit was not also really taken into account, which further complicates matters now, because previously what came by road that was going to be transported by air was treated as air freight cargo. On the 1st of January, it now falls under road cargo. So all the cargo coming in from the UK has to be rescreened. So there's additional cost, complexity, and time that is required, which should not be so. I mean, we should be looking to make it as seamless as possible at the end of the day. And as was mentioned by the representative on the security side, security checks and screening methodologies must be standardized throughout the EU and globally if possible at the end of the day. To make it as seamless once again.
Great. Then quickly giving the floor to Fredrik. What in your view, I mean, do you have any other points to add to what Richard shared with us? Maybe.
Richard gave quite of a comprehensive position, and many of the points I tend to agree with. But I do believe that Francesco brought a point which we do need to remind ourselves every so often, that aviation, especially cargo, is very much of a global industry. And these are the items that we need to think on a very broader scale, not only from the member countries alone, but also how they actually integrate with the other continents and the other countries. This is highly important because in the end of the day, like also mentioned here, we're talking about aviation, about safety and security. The other point being a part of a global supply chain is reliability. And the more we have complexity within our industry and different regulations from country to another, this actually compromises that particular element of reliability that we're trying to get forward. And I can only now emphasize that as we are having critical shipments, such as the COVID-19 vaccines that are transported, this is something that should be emphasized. Obviously not to the level or to the context that we would be starting to compromise safety and security, but rather to endorse the fact that we would have similar type of policies in countries so that we don't allow these complexities to overpower as we are trying to rebuild our industry. This is highly important because eventually adding complexity in front of simplicity should not be the case. And this goes actually to across everything, including security related items. Thank you.
Thank you, Fredrik. Then moving on to another key topic on the policy side at European level, it's the greening of our economy and the goal of the European Commission to implement the European Green Deal. Obviously, the discussions are focused on COVID-19 in the last few months, and rightly so, but this still remains very high on the agenda and is definitely a challenge that needs to be tackled by the aviation industry and the air cargo sector in addition. So turning back to you, Richard, could you share a few elements with our audience on what are the upcoming initiatives? Maybe 2 minutes?
Okay, I think the greatest levers of directly reducing CO2 emissions for industry is going to be the use of sustainable aviation fuels, SAF, new technology, especially in respect of engines, or just to reduce the amount of flying that we currently take place now. But in terms of the pandemic, we've seen what impact a reduced amount of flying can have on economies, on jobs, and on people's livelihoods at the end of the day. In my view, it is going to be extremely challenging for this industry to reach the targets the EU are setting for itself. It is a fallacy today that a flight can fly 100% using sustainable fuel. It is always going to be blended with fossil fuels, and depending on the certification, the blend can be up to 50-50. But there's a significant cost attached to that, which people might not realize at the end of the day. The cost of a ton of SAF is probably 3 to 4 times the cost of a normal fossil fuel. So the answer is, okay, guys, you want us to reduce the emissions, etc. How are we going to achieve that on an economic and sustainable basis? Governments cannot always subsidize in the long term. That is not going to work at the end of the day. So the focus from the governments will have to be to make the necessary investments together with private-public partnerships to be able to develop that technology to produce SAF in sufficient quantities to enable airlines to operate on an economically sustainable basis and also satisfy the requirements of improving the environment, of reducing CO2 emissions and improving the environment as well. Unless we can achieve that, I see it very difficult at the end of the day for airlines to achieve the targets that are being set now. We operate in a very capital-intensive industry, so if I want to buy new aircraft, if they are available, it's going to cost billions to the airline. And how do I recover that investment at the end of the day? So someone has got to pick up the cost. Is it going to be the consumer? Is it going to be the shipper? Is it going to be the airline, etc.? Are people going to have to accept the lower rates of return in order to reduce CO2 emissions? But we fully support it as an airline. The questions I have is how do we do it on an economically sustainable basis? Because if I compare it to the conditions today, I'll bankrupt the airline if I have to use SAF fuels to the greatest extent possible, and no one compensates me for it. And governments can only subsidize to a certain extent, and that is not the answer. So what has to take place is an exponential increase in the production of SAF. And it's also going to depend on the availability of the feedstock, because there are certain biofuels that are not acceptable because it takes away agricultural land. So from my perspective, it's going to be what feedstock is available, how much can it produce at the end of the day in order to get to what we want to achieve. And is it going to result in mandates or restrictions now being put on as to the number of flights that can be executed in order to keep CO2 to achieve the targets on CO2 reduction? But from a Cargolux perspective, it will be a significant challenge, not only for us, but for the whole industry as well.
So you present quite a difficult equation there to solve.
Yeah.
What, in your view, Fredrik, would be the best path forward on this before we turn to the conclusion?
Sorry, the line was breaking up. Was that a question to me?
Yeah.
Yes, if you could share your view on the best pathway for greening aviation cargo.
Indeed, I think there is a lot of complexity that has to do still with the sustainability questions that we have for our industry. What has been echoing into the conversations is actually more and more we are having a determination how we've come to the calculation, rather than to putting efforts how we're going to actually benefit and reducing the CO2 emissions. We can already demonstrate that from our fleet. We see a difference in our own fleet between the modern A350 and the 330 equipment have a difference of 20% in carbon dioxide footprint. But currently, as we do in the calculations, this is being considered to be quite similar. I already believe that we have benefits in our industry that have done or performed by companies who have invested into a modern fleet, such as Finnair. And only to echo the hub that we have, which is also very much of a green facility and BREEAM certified as well. I think benefits already are emerging, but we need to finalize a way how are we actually going to calculate this, and not to spend more time of the methodology behind the calculation, but rather put more proof into the pudding of what are the measures that we're actually doing.
Thank you very much for your input. Those are clearly huge challenges. The pandemic will continue to guide policymakers and the cargo industry in the coming months. But on top of that, we've discussed briefly the question of greening aviation. We also touched upon digitalization and security. So all those topics will definitely stay high on our agenda. So I would invite our speakers to maybe give us one last word of their outlook for 2021 in maybe 1 minute or half a minute each, looking at the time, maybe starting with Francesco. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will be surely very brief on that. I think the air cargo sector has the fantastic opportunity to exercise the highest visibility and the role that is currently playing. This is something that our political masters and the public opinion will have to remember for many years. So the way air cargo operators have reacted, have faced the challenges, the creativity that they have exercised in delivering solutions to the problem. Peter Gerber mentioned this in the previous panel. The flexibility that they have demonstrated is really remarkable. From our aviation security standpoint, air cargo remains an attractive target for terrorists, and we need to remain vigilant. So the regulations are constantly evolving as the threat evolves, with new rules and requirements we need to fulfill. Our challenge for is to establish this joint venture between regulators and operators to maintain the supply chain robust and resilient.
Thank you. Tânia, can I give you the floor?
Well, in my view, and very quickly, I think the biggest challenge in the short run is going to be to ensure a smooth process for the distribution of the vaccines, and of course other sanitary goods like ventilators, etc. And for the airlines, I think the main challenge is to preserve revenue until the ramp up. In the long run, I think the main challenge, and I agree with Richard, it will be sustainability. There is in general a conscience that aviation contributes to climate change, of course, like many other economic sectors, but that will have an impact in air travel growth and demand in general, and that will have also an impact, specific impact in air cargo. But of course, this also represents an opportunity for innovation. We'll see from the staff's proposal from the Commission what kind of equilibrium will come up. Of course, the biggest opportunity, and I talked about this in all my interventions, I believe, is a bigger conscience of the need to cooperate and of course the tendency to digitalization. I think the role of the Portuguese presidency will be to enable common solutions, harmonized solutions, so that, of course, all the pandemic situation could be overcome, well, as swiftly and as efficiently as possible.
Thank you. Richard, a few words on 2021?
Yeah, I think 2020 was a major learning exercise for the EU. 2021 is now going to be implementation in order to deal with this pandemic effectively and efficiently. It will be another challenging year, but I think there will be more positives than negatives ultimately at the end of the day.
Thank you. Fredrik, I give you the last words.
Thank you very much. Yeah, 2021 is certainly going to be still a challenging year, but hopefully as the vaccines are starting to become more distributed and more vaccines are also becoming approved and available, we are starting to see the beginning of the end of the pandemic. Whether or not and when it would actually end is something that I will not discuss now. That being said, from our side, we will continue to drive our sustainability strategy. This is something that will not go away despite the pandemic. We will continue to drive that very relentlessly, but at the same time, we will also stay quite curious on and apply discovery onto the digitization enablers and how we can actually make our industry much more efficient through those tools. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you, to Tânia, Richard, Fredrik, and Francesco for taking some of your time this afternoon to share your views with us and with our audience. I would invite everyone to have a look at the A4E position paper that you can find on our website. And I would now turn to Thomas Reinhardt for the concluding words for this session. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnes, and thank you again to all of the speakers, in particular the CEOs of our member companies, Cargolux, Lufthansa, Finnair, but also DHL, of course, and the speakers of the Portuguese presidency in the European Commission. It's always difficult to conclude. I mean, to make concluding remarks of such a panel. I think we've seen a great panel, but there's been a lot of detail. So let me talk a little bit about, look back at the two panels, the discussion. Panel one, I think it was clear that we said that the air cargo industry has played a crucial role in 2020 in the economy, in the movement of goods, in helping to, in a way, help to contain the virus through the vaccination programs. The sector showed flexibility and quick thinking, which is something typical, I think, of aviation, but also certainly for air cargo. Converging passengers into planes, and we heard the sort of new term Praetor a couple of times, Praetor aircraft. All of that, the conversion to safeguard medical supplies and keep the supply chains or supplies flowing. Praetors really have proven to be key in transporting the vaccine to smaller regional airports as well. Of course, upcoming challenges on panel 1 were discussed, and they include the handling of these vaccines on the ground once they're offloaded by the cargo carriers. Also, an important point is that the crisis has really, I think, shown the importance of good relationships between the cargo carriers on the one hand and the pharmaceutical providers on the other to accurately forecast the medical deliveries. It has also helped the sector transport vaccines in large volumes, securely and in a timely way, while not overwhelming the cargo network's capacity. It was also said that should more demand come, that the capacity from an air cargo perspective is available. So our speakers were quite confident on that. What the sector needs from governments is mainly reliable government communications and harmonized decisions when it comes to travel restrictions. And we need clear information regarding the measures governments actually are enacting. And we need more alignment between these governments overall. And again, this is also a message or a claim that you also find back on the passenger side, by the way. So it's not only true for cargo. On panel 2 then, great discussion on obviously the year of challenges, which was 2020 for the cargo carriers in terms of lack of capacity in the face of exploding demand. However, looking ahead, more national restrictions, as we can experience today, are affecting pilots and mechanics and will make it harder for essential staff to get to work. I believe that's a point Richard clearly mentioned. Background checks and screening must become standardized across the EU and ideally also globally. The Portuguese presidency, Tânia, in that sense, highlighted the necessity to reinforce common rules on travel restrictions, which is very good news, and also continue to focus on digital and sustainable recovery, which are top priorities for the Portuguese presidency. Last but not least, there's a clear lack of coordination or prioritization in the EU when it comes to vaccination of air transport workers. It is also a position that A4E has clearly taken and really is pushing for together with IATA recently. This is particularly the case vis-à-vis other non-EU countries, by the way. As far as 21 is concerned, so this year we need to keep safety and security in the focus, even though some derogations on certain rules will continue to be required to address the current situation, of course. And in this context, some of the main legislative priorities for this year will be, as mentioned by Francesco, the upcoming Commission proposals on harmonization of security practices, screening and equipment across the EU, but also applying to non-EU carriers. Also a new EU regime on background checks and the Commission's cybersecurity strategy, something we're really looking forward to as well. Last but not least, greening cargo aviation will clearly be a challenge. Richard really mentioned a very good point between the sustainability of greening from an environment perspective, but also from an economic perspective. There's also something like economic sustainability. So we need to find not only cost-efficient ways to green aviation, and this is a more broader debate within aviation. Aviation community is very committed to reducing CO2 emissions. However, we need to see how we could make that work, economically work long-term, and there are various ways of doing that. I mean, the need for investment in SAFs was mentioned. We need to obviously upscale the availability of SAFs very quickly with the help of government. But again, long-term, the availability of SAF should be a system of supply that should work on itself in a cost-efficient manner. So thank you very much again to all of the speakers. Thank you to moderators Sam and Agnes for doing a very good job in trying to channel these very good thoughts. We are looking forward as A4E to working with all of you on the cargo side, not only on COVID-19 related issues and sustainability, but obviously these are the two main chapters I think that will continue to dominate our agenda, certainly this year. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Have a good day. Bye-bye.